Hello and welcome to the Manchester is Red podcast. My name is Steven Railston. I'm back as your host. Just a quick note before we get into this podcast. I think we've become aware of some audio issues in the last podcast. I may have been a little bit quiet, Samuel may have been a little bit loud, and I believe some of you have had to flick between the audio settings. We apologise for that, and we believe we've addressed the issue for this podcast. If it's not addressed, then God knows. I think I'll hang my head in shame, or the producer will, and we'll make some sackings, I think. Samuel, should we? I'm joined by Samuel Luckhurst. Sackings, a nice little segment maybe for this podcast. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. But there need to be some personnel changes on our desk with a couple of vacancies, and I suppose there was a few parallels there with United.
Where are you today? There's an interesting backdrop. I've not seen.
I'm at home, but yeah, it's a different background. But yes, I am at home, but I've got a different vantage point.
Yeah, I can tell. Anyways, football. We're 6 days pick-up final, Samuel, and there's not been a decision on Eric Ten Hag. We're told earlier in the week it wasn't going to be imminent. He is still here. He's still at the football club. You kind of discussed it earlier in the week and suggested it's not a good look for INEOS, considering they've had 5 months to make a decision. All the evidence is there in the Premier League campaign, and we suggested as well a decision on Ten Hag shouldn't be decided by a one-off game, the FA Cup final, even though they did win it. What are your thoughts now the dust has settled on that result and the week has progressed?
As we discussed on Monday, the story has shifted on to INEOS and Sir Jim Ratcliffe, and there has been quite a lot of focus on Ratcliffe's body language and the way he was with Pep Guardiola, contrasted with how he was with Eric Ten Hag. I think it was on the Telegraph earlier in the week. It had quite a nifty tool there where you could scroll along and contrast the pictures of Ratcliffe with Guardiola and Ratcliffe with Ten Hag, and of course with Guardiola, who's embracing him. With Ten Hag, he shook his hand and gave him a pat on the back, and people have obviously that's not gone unnoticed, and really the silence is deafening still. It is strange that we've had a quiet week. I don't think any of us envisaged that this week would be uneventful, or there would be a midweek lull. And we're speaking on it's lunchtime on Friday afternoon, and there's nothing's forthcoming. And as you said, we were told it wouldn't be imminent at the start of the week, which I don't agree with. Whether they're keeping him or whether they're sacking him, they should have made a swift decision. As Tony Soprano said, more was lost by indecision than the wrong decision. And I completely agree with that. It's just a little baffling that some very successful men who are very, very wealthy and have got into that position of wealth through ruthless decision making and clearly prudent and good decisions, are suddenly in this position where they're looking a bit looking indecisive. And I suppose with football clubs and with owners of football clubs, there have been so many successful men that have gone into football, and football has made a mockery of them. And there is we're nowhere near that point yet with INEOS, but there is a slight danger that could turn out to be the case. I just don't know what is Sir Dave Brailsford doing on a weekly basis. Do they need a week to watch the 90 odd minutes against City in such forensic detail and draw conclusions from that, and then put it in the keep or sack dossier and go through all that evidence again? It just it's really quite strange. It's like if you sat on a jury and you go out and you debate whether someone's guilty or not guilty, and it seems like at the moment it almost feels like it's a hung jury. It's strange that we're in this position and they've not communicated anything, whichever side of the fence they fall. I don't think many envisaged that here we'd be this nearly a week after the FA Cup final, and with calendars about to turn over to June, with Ten Hag in limbo and a lot of other people in limbo. And of course you've got people at the club who are working at the club this week, and they may not be employees of the club next week because of those decisions that have to be made as well. And there was a good tweet from Kieran Maguire in the week about how getting rid of 250 odd staff, you'd have to get rid of that many people to kind of cover a player's salary of 8 million or 9 million a year. And the smart way of saving costs would of course be to not spend money badly on players who aren't worth that money and aren't worth the salary. So it was an uplifting end to last season, but it's, for a lot of people, particularly connected to the club and who actually work for the club, it's quite a fraught time still.
Why do you think there has been this hold up then on communicating a decision either way? Is it because of the emotions provoked by winning the FA Cup final? Because I think if they had lost that game, a decision might have come sooner, I believe. And now they've actually won that trophy, and the celebrations, fantastic scenes. It was a brilliant day at Wembley last Saturday. Do you think that's played a part in delaying the decision? Because of the reaction from the fan base, the emotions provoked, and it all kind of comes into one. However, on the flip side, we've argued against that because emotions can't come into a decision like this, can it?
No, and I agree with having a respectable amount of breathing space, but you've still got to get on with the job, and you can't stand still. And it feels like they are motionless at the moment. And if emotion has come into it, then these guys maybe shouldn't be in a position of running a football club. But we genuinely do not know that. Whatever decision they communicate eventually, they've got key questions to ask. To answer on the matter, and I'm sure we won't get answers to a lot of those questions. I mean, if he stays, why did it take so long to review it? If he goes, why did it take so long to decide to dismiss Ten Hag? I wrote a piece on it, I think, for yesterday morning, so I can't remember it all verbatim, but it's on the website if anyone hasn't read it and is interested in reading it. But that's, I think, a lot of some fans I speak to as well. They're like they can't bring emotion into it. Like they're almost staggered that INEOS would allow that to cloud their judgment. It's fair enough to look at that performance against City last week and look at the results and the performances against Wolves and West Ham in February, i.e. 3 games where United had a fullish squad, won all of those games, played possibly their best in terms of how enterprising and attack-minded and impressive they were. The first 45 minutes against Wolves at Molineux was probably their best of the season. In terms of what you'd want from a Ten Hag, from Ten Hag's United, and how dominant they were that night. And then, of course, West Ham, a few days later, it was just one change. That was because Varane was rested for Maguire, and they won that game quite clinically 3-0. West Ham, I thought, were pretty reasonable on the day. They were pretty decent, but it was still a good clinical win for United. And, of course, with the cup final, they rocked up at Wembley with all of their best players available apart from Luke Shaw. And, of course, Casemiro withdrew, and they did take 22 players down, which indicated that there was a fitness issue. So we have to take that at face value, even though it was quite convenient and quite, I think a lot of us were quite suspicious of the circumstances and particularly the timing when his name was on the team sheet. And then 15 minutes later, not even that, his name was removed from the club zone team sheets. But ultimately, they were just one player shy of their best 11, whatever that would be, for the FA Cup final, and they had their best performance under Ten Hag. And does that come into it? Is that the one element of this whole decision making process that tips the balance in favour of keeping Ten Hag? Because look at what he can do with that team when the majority, if not all, the players are available. But there's still a lot more to pore over beyond that. And as we've discussed, all that evidence was banked and witnessed and analysed long before the end of the season, and even after the season ended against Brighton. There were 6 days between the Brighton game and the FA Cup final, and those new power brokers, they should have been conducting their review then, I'd argue, and then you okay, if you want some additional time for a review after the FA Cup final, fair enough, but it shouldn't require 6 more days just poring over one game and analysing the tactics of it. I know football is not short of its pseudo intellects who love to pore through every minute detail of tactics, but it wasn't so fascinating that it merits 6 days worth of attention. There was a lot to admire about United, but ultimately it was the raw emotion and the commitment and them just getting the basics right on the day. As very good as they were, it was a tactically astute performance, but it was a United win over City that was also quite reminiscent of how they beat City under Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, which there's nothing wrong with going about that method. I mean, Real Madrid kind of did it to an extent. I know they lost the game, but they won it on penalty shootout in the Champions League. But City have so much of the ball that it would be daft to try and have as much of the ball, if not more of the ball than City. Arsenal got a good draw against them. It was certainly an overrated draw at the time, but it felt like quite a creditable point, even though the game wasn't much to write home from the game. And United went about it in pretty much the same way, but got their 2 goals and absolutely merited their win. So everyone has praised them, and we've championed Ten Hag's tactics and his approach on the day, and the players completely deserved the compliments that they were showered with after the game, because it was a Herculean effort to beat that City side who not lost in 34 or 35 games. But there's only so much you can dwell on one game in a season of 52 games.
Maybe Sir Dave Brailsford, Jean-Claude Blanc and Sir Jim Ratcliffe have just been sitting around the table and watching Kobe Mainoo's goal for the last 6 days, Samuel, just on repeat. Not doing any decision-making or conversing, just watching that goal. I wouldn't blame them if that was the case. I think
they would be forgiven for that, I think, yes.
Yeah, we both expected to essentially be on call on the Sunday after the FA Cup final, because we were both don't have days off. But it has been a very quiet week, and we weren't expecting that. You're actually going on holiday next week, aren't you, Samuel, to the States, I believe?
I am, yeah.
So that's very selfish of you, I think. How didn't you plan for this? I don't know how. It's just a lack of foresight. Incredible from you. Moving on, you've done the article today about United's transfer targets kind of being limbo over this wait for a decision on Ten Hag being communicated. And that's just common sense, surely, isn't it, Samuel? When you have uncertainty hanging over a manager, you cannot plan for transfers. And does that not suggest that other clubs can steal a march in the Premier League on United in the summer? I know it's only been 6 days, and that might sound a bit dramatic, but clubs stop preparing for the next season before the current campaign's even ended.
Yeah, they're behind the curve already. And others, you look at Bayern Munich and Barcelona, they've already hired new coaches. There are other elite clubs that have vacancies. I don't think AC Milan have got a new coach yet. Juventus haven't got a new coach yet either. Chelsea are about to hire Enzo Maresca from Leicester City, and Arne Slot was lined up quite some time ago by Liverpool. But as I said earlier, when people are just about to flip over their calendars to June, and United don't know whether the incumbent manager will still be in situ in July, that is a problem, because it naturally it just affects your planning for the transfer market. There's no clarity there. When United have changed managers at the conclusion of previous seasons, in the case of Van Gaal and Mourinho, those were announced in May. Ten Hag, of course, was announced before the end of that season that he was coming in. That was in late April, I believe. So if you're going to make that announcement whether Ten Hag is staying or going, and it's coming in June, again, that's not a great look for the new power brokers who've officially been in control for just over 3 months, but we all know that they've been running the show for a little while longer than that. Omar Barada, that was announced in the January, wasn't it? And I don't think the minority stakeholding had been ratified by that time. And Sir Dave Brailsford and Jim Ratcliffe had been into Carrington, and Brailsford had been into Carrington a few times when, I think, before the Christmas Eve announcement as well. So they've they've had quite a lot of time to get their feet under the table and assess. And with transfers, of course, that we always say ahead of a summer, this needs to be United's busiest summer, it feels like. And certainly with the need to be a lot more proactive in the sellers market, that does force their hand a bit. But they also do have players who've outstayed their welcome there, and due to their contract situations, they just naturally need to be sold. They have budgeted for at least three key signings. We all know that they need more signings than that, and they'll be dependent on some of the outgoings, and they have leverage to make some of those signings, as it is in the case of Raphael Varane leaving, Anthony Marshall leaving. We all know that United need and want a centre-back. We all know that United need and want a striker as well to support Rasmus Højlund. But they've got to be pretty urgent about it when they finally communicate the decision on the manager, because that is going to have a big bearing, even though the manager is not going to have the same level of control that Erik Ten Hag has had in his previous two summer transfer windows. But it's still the coach or the manager, whatever title that they occupy next season, that they're still essentially the figurehead of Manchester United as a football club. And that image of the manager, it's until recently that's always been the direction they've gone in. They've wanted a manager, not a coach. That could change because of the way INEOS want to operate, and whenever Dan Ashworth comes in as sporting director, there'll be an awful lot of responsibility placed on him in terms of the running of the football club, and particularly recruitment, which we all know how critical it is. And so, yeah, it is natural that at the moment the movers in the market are, or non-movers, are managers, because of the amount of clubs that and quite prestigious clubs that are looking for a new guy to come in. And even someone like Kieran McKenna, who Ipswich have only just got back to the Premier League for the first time in 22 years, of course. In the end, a lot of people will have looked at that and thought that's kind of played out as expected. And I don't blame them for thinking that way. There was genuine contact from United and interest from United, and the interest went both ways there. But from what I was told, he did take his time in terms of thinking. I think he discounted Chelsea quite early on. He did have a substantial offer from Ipswich. There is a lot of logic to staying with Ipswich, but also it may indicate that there has been a development at United that has convinced him to stay put at Portman Road. But he decided to stay at Ipswich on Monday. The contract was announced yesterday on Thursday. We're here on Friday, and we still don't know what's happening with the Man United managers. So, as per normal, it's United who are the ones who look a little bit dormant at the moment, even though they're under new decision makers. And I never thought I'd be looking at other sites to see what's going on there and see that United were actually quite low down the pecking order in a week which really it's got two meaningful games. The Conference League was on Wednesday night, and it's the Champions League on Saturday night.
I mean, it would have been a huge step, wouldn't it, for Kieran McKenna to have replaced Ten Hag if he is to be sacked. I mean, he's clearly a fantastic coach with a very bright future, back-to-back promotions with Ipswich, which was a remarkable achievement. But that step up from Ipswich to United is a massive step, isn't it, if we're being completely honest. He's clearly got a very promising CV, coming from Tottenham and then going to United's under-18s, where he had success, promoted to the first team by Jose Mourinho, retained by Solskjaer, obviously, and then worked with Ralph Rangnick. But it's probably one for the future, isn't it? He is a United fan. He supported the club when he was a boy. He's 38 years old. He's going to be the youngest manager in the Premier League next season. So he's still very much got time on his side. And I don't think his season in the Premier League with Ipswich, even if they get relegated, is going to do his reputation any harm at all. So a bright future ahead for McKenna. If we're focusing on a player, then Samuel, you've written a line on Jared Branthwaite, some interest in him from United, which seems to be floating about for a while now. And Everton are kind of holding out for a fee between 70 and 80 million, which, in my opinion, is a lot of money for a player. of his, I was going to say of quality, that's a bit unfair because he is very, very promising. And I like what I've seen of him when I watch him, but that's a huge fee for someone where he is in his career.
And there's every chance it's merely a negotiating tactic, because if the offer was closer to 60 million, would Everton, in the relative uncertainty that they face with new ownership, would they turn their noses up at that? It's one of those that you can see quite a lot of bartering, where it's if it was to come to his sale, not necessarily to United but to another club, that there might be an upfront fee and then add-ons. Everybody knows that United have issues with profitability and sustainability, those rules, and that's why they need to sell quite a few players this summer. But also, I don't think that under the new hierarchy, they're going to want to kind of resemble the previous regime in terms of just chucking money at the problem and panicking. And of course, if you want really good players, you have to pay quite a lot of money. That's always been the case in football. But there is a way of going about it, of being more savvy with negotiations and not just yielding out of panic, which is what United have continued to do under the incumbent manager. We saw that with the Anthony fee, how that ballooned from an initial asking price of 60 million euros to 100 million euros. And with Højlund last year, his value just seemed to shoot up. Just not necessarily just because of Paris Saint-Germain's bid, but it wasn't a surprise that United, I mean, effectively they did overpay for Højlund, as good as the potential is there, but £72 million for a striker of that profile. And I get it that United are taxed because they're Man United, and everyone knows that they're not shy in spending money when push comes to shove, and they can be taken for a ride. But it was still quite an extravagant amount of money that they spent on a player that people at the club were telling us early on in the pre-season tour that they wouldn't spend more than £60 million on him. In the end, it was 64 million up front, rising to 72 million. So everyone knows United have form for this, and I'm sure a lot of clubs will try and take them for a ride again this summer. As far as Branthwaite is concerned, I don't blame Everton for valuing him within that bracket, given his age, given his contract is, I mean, he's 21, his contract's up in 2027, I think it is. So there's got a fair bit of time to run on that. He's about to become an England international. He's yet to attain his first cap, but he's been in the squad. He's in the provisional squad for the Euros. He could make his debut next month in June, either before the Euros or at the Euros. And just by virtue that he's an Everton player as well, I think always when there's a good young player who comes through at Everton, people naturally assume that it's going to be United who will be in for them, and that was the case with John Stones. And in the end, he still went to Manchester, but he went to City, and he's been a tremendous player for them. So it does help that Everton are also on United's doorstep. And I mean, yesteryear it would only be United before City had the takeover in 2008, because Everton were never going to sell Wayne Rooney to Liverpool, and Wayne Rooney was never going to go to Liverpool either. So I'd hesitate to say that United have a free run at Branthwaite. It remains to be seen whether they would want him as a starting centre half. But whichever defender they pay top dollar for, logically you think that they have to go into the team alongside Martinez, ideally. But they will probably need a second centre back as well if Johnny Evans was to leave, because his contract's up at the end of June. And also Victor Lindelof has to be sold where he's out of contract next year. So even if just one of those players go, you still need an extra defender to come in, particularly given the defensive injury issues they've had this season. And I know they've got the numbers there, but whether it's Ten Hag as the manager or another manager, they would still want and need better quality and depth.
I just think that's a crazy. Even 60 million, for example, see if Everton turned around and said, right, 60 million for Branthwaite. He's 21 years old. I've just checked there. He's been 54 senior appearances. It's a lot of money for a player of that profile, is it not? And do you know what? I'd almost put it on, this is a big statement, but I'd almost put it on par with 80 million in Harry Maguire, who was 26 at the time when signing from Leicester. who's a bit older, and he proved himself a lot more than Branthwaite had. I think that investment would be significant. And you look at the options in Europe, surely that's what your scouting network's for. I think there is better options out there for a cheaper fee than for 60 million. It's a lot of money, especially when considering they need a striker, they need a defensive midfielder and a centre half. They really need a new spine of the team, don't they, Samuel? Which we seem to say most summers actually with United. We'll leave it there for part one, and we'll be back in a moment for part two. Welcome back to part two of the Manchester's Red podcast. We're going to delve into Benny McCarthy's quotes on Jadon Sancho now in this segment. I always quite like watching McCarthy, Samuel, if you go to open training, because he seems very, very popular. He's always got a smile on his face. Seems to be laughing and joking around. We spoke to a South African radio station this week, and he discussed his future. He basically said he couldn't turn down a job in management and that he hadn't been offered a new contract from United. His deal expires this summer, which obviously isn't a surprise when you consider the uncertainty around Ten Hag. But the quotes about Jadon Sancho came out as well. I presume you've read them, have you?
I have. As a colleague said, they were going to write it up, but they didn't, as it was a case of man makes strong points while ignoring a key fact, and that was certainly my takeaway from it.
Well, I'll just read out a little segment. He's obviously discussing why Jadon Sancho didn't apologise to Ten Hag, and he said, I spoke to the manager and I said to him that you have to understand the delicacy. I told him that I think Jadon feels that if he apologises, then he's going to be considered as someone who doesn't train hard, that doesn't work hard, and that everything that was said against him was true. It goes on, but that's basically the gist of the quotes. Has he got a point? I don't think so. We discussed this months ago, and it's an apology is an apology. It's really not as deep as those quotes imply. I think sometimes you've just got to do what you don't really want to and be the bigger man, apologise and move on. And Sancho failed to do that. Obviously, he left for Dortmund on loan, and it has worked out. Or he could start in the Champions League final on Saturday night. But what do you think of those quotes, Samuel?
The key fact he overlooked was the Twitter post. I don't know why that wasn't referenced by McCarthy or the interviewer. That's why Ten Hag sought an apology. He wasn't seeking an apology for Sancho's poor training performances. It was for accusing the manager of lying. That's why he was training in a separate building and having his food ferried to him. That's kind of like the be all and end all to it. And he had to apologise for that. If he'd apologised for that, which he should have done, because it was pretty disgraceful of him to publicly. But as I've said before, if a Manchester United player publicly accuses the manager of lying and does so like that, they shouldn't play for the club again. And he shouldn't play for the club again. The fact that he's not apologised over that says a hell of a lot more about Sancho than it does Ten Hag. I've very, very little sympathy for Sancho. He's clearly got his admirers, and he's not short of acolytes, and his development really coincided with that era where I think there are a lot of young fans these days who they support players over clubs, and they're enthralled to certain players. And Sancho is someone who you look at his highlights reel and he looks like a FIFA player. The way he, certainly at Dortmund, the way he operates at speed, his skill set, and there are a lot of young kids out there who empathise with that, who buzz off seeing a player express himself like that. But FIFA's not real life, and he's discovered that at Manchester United, and he's done very well to help Dortmund to the Champions League final. As you noted a few weeks ago, it seemed like his legacy on it during his second spell at Dortmund so far is based on that one game, the semi-final first leg against Paris Saint-Germain, when he was exceptional. He operated at speed. He was direct. He was the player that I thought United were signing, but they didn't get, albeit up against a pretty poor left back in Nuno Mendes. But to still perform that level is very impressive, given what was at stake. But Dortmund finished, as Ten Hag noted, Dortmund finished outside the Champions League qualifying places, didn't they? I think, did they come fifth in the end?
I think they were fifth.
Bundesliga. Yeah. So the Bundesliga season hasn't gone particularly well for them. If they don't win the Champions League final against Madrid, they'll be in the Europa League next season with United. And again, it's the inevitable hype around one game, which was the only major game shown in England that night. And of course, an English audience had a vested interest because there was an English player playing in it who had been jettisoned by Man United. So it was easy to take a pot shot at United. But I thought that Sancho's performance said more about him than United. We've been through it all before, that Southgate thought his training form during the Euros 3 years ago was poor, and that accounted for his lack of playing time before he started the quarter-final against Ukraine. There were issues with his timekeeping at Manchester City. He went AWOL during his last summer to force a move to Dortmund.
I mean, there was issues at Dortmund as well, Samuel, during his first stint there. He was dropped from the squad a few times. He was late to training. There was a fallout with Favre, I believe. So it's been a common theme throughout his whole career, this.
Yeah, and that's why I think Brendan McCarthy's quotes, they look a little bit odd when he's talking about being late and things like that. I mean, you should apologise for being late. We're all, I know we've all probably done it, and we don't mean to, but if it becomes a recurring issue, then there's something amiss there. But essentially, Ten Hag wanted an apology because one of his players went on Twitter within an hour of him giving an honest answer to my question and accused him of lying. And that's why he wasn't in the squad photo, and that's why he was banished to the academy building. That's why he's not played for United again. Since then. And I've no issue whatsoever with the way Ten Hag has handled Sancho. I know it sounds a little bit extreme and isolating, and there are mental health considerations to take into account as well, of a player training in a separate building and having to get changed in a locked door due to safeguarding issues, given that it's used by young professionals aged under the age of 18. But Sancho did bring that upon himself, and he could have ended it if he apologised, which he should have done. He should have apologised for what he did by putting that post on Twitter and pinning it to his profile. I know he deleted it eventually, or he took it down, but the damage was done, and it was on his profile for quite some time.
A lot was made of that first leg performance against PSG because he was exceptional. He was very good. But I mean, second leg performance, he was a bit quiet. And then if you actually look at his overall performances at the very start of his loan in January, the German press were wondering, was this the same player as we saw and watched in England? We wondering what happened to the Jadon Sancho that they saw in Germany during the first spell. He's had 3 assists, 3 goals, I think 24 appearances. So he's not exactly been very good in those 5 months across the board. It's just that one performance against PSG, which, as you say, was on a big TV in England and broadcast to a huge audience. And the commentators really did go overboard that night, didn't they? I made that point on the podcast as well. United actually received €3.5 million for a 6-month loan for Sancho, and there was a further €4 million added on in potential add-ons. Some of those clauses have been triggered because Dortmund reached the semi-finals of the Champions League, and United have received another payment because obviously they've reached the final at Wembley on Saturday. So I actually think it's been quite good business, Samuel. I know there's a massive element of fortune there that Dortmund have reached the Champions League final, but considering that the whole world knew United needed to get rid of this player, he'd been sitting around Carrington for months training on his own. They've got him out of Dortmund. They've boosted his profile, and when you look at the summer, head to the summer transfer window, that can only be a good thing as far as his transfer value is concerned. I know Ten Hag was asked about that, wasn't he, after the first leg performance against PSG? And it'll be fascinating to watch him on Saturday night. Everyone will be, to see how he performs, because if he can deliver a strong performance, that will only help United obtain a decent fee from this summer. And I mean, I know, I think 30 million's been suggested, hasn't it? I think if United can bank 30 million, that would be pretty decent.
As I think a starting fee to negotiate up from, that would be logical if it is possible to negotiate up from it. And the fact that the Champions League final is at Wembley is quite fascinating, that it's almost a year on to the day since Sancho last played there. And when we were going through the starting 11 in United's Cup final team in 2023. I think I reeled 10 of them off, and then I couldn't remember the last one. Of course, it was him, and he was
He was a ghost that
unmemorable
day,
because
wasn't
he was anonymous.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was. He was. It was the Sancho that we saw far too much of at United in terms of his performance level, and it will be fascinating to see how his performance contrasts, or whether it's similar to the FA Cup final against City 12 months ago, because he said that Dortmund is home. That was the word he used, and he clearly feels quite wedded to the place. And if that's the case, I'm sure United would be welcome to. They'd be welcome to have him permanently, and we'll have to see if that materialises. I mean, I don't think Dortmund can necessarily afford his salary, but there's clearly there are ways of coming to those arrangements, whether it be another season-long loan for him with an obligation to buy at the end of it, irrespective of how often he plays, or if they're just contractually bound by that and they've got the money to make that deal permanent again. And if Sancho wants it as well, then I think it's logical for both sides to explore that, and I'm sure they will sit down at a table over the summer and discuss the possibility of Sancho staying in Dortmund. And as far as Wembley is concerned, let's face it, that's probably these finals are the only opportunities he's going to get to play there again, because his international career, unfortunately, it does seem over. I mean, nobody was expecting him to be. I don't think he was even filed as an outside bet to get in the Euro squad. He's exiled from the international squad, has been close to 3 years, and there's an awful lot of competition on the flanks, and there could be another high-profile player who's cut, possibly. I mean, looking at Jack Grealish's situation at Manchester City, I think that has to be considered by Southgate, and it was strange seeing Grealish walk through the mix zone last week in a Gucci tracksuit, smiling mischievously with flip-flops on, his hood pulled up, the only City representative not in City regalia. And then the following day he's nearly falling off an open-top bus when his output has been, I think someone said it's not far off Anthony's, which is not a comparison that any winger wants to hear. But that's another example of another possible high-profile England winger who won't make the Euro squad after Marcus Rashford wasn't even named in the provisional squad, and he certainly had a much better day at Wembley than Jack Grealish did.
It was September 2021 when Sancho
Yeah.
last made the England squad, which, I mean, September's just around the corner now. We're almost in June. So it could be 3 years since Sancho last made an England squad, which just shows you his fall from grace has been spectacular, really. And interestingly, Samuel, Sancho and Grealish obviously joined United and City in the same summer. And there was a lot of noise, hype, I guess, around both of those players, a lot of high expectations, and neither of them have lived up to them, unfortunately, in Manchester. Moving on.
Grealish, sorry, he got 3 goals this season for City, which is as many as Anthony got for United.
Doesn't really get talked about as much, does it? That, I mean, we've criticised
No.
Anthony on this podcast a lot, and a lot of it, I mean, all of it's been fair because he's just not been good enough. But on the Jack Grealish side of things, I'm not sure if our colleagues on the City podcast have drawn attention to it, but I think his performances have probably gone under the radar, especially he was 100 million, wasn't he, in the summer of 2021? A lot of money.
Yeah.
Dortmund have actually been linked to Mason Greenwood, Samuel. There were some quotes from their sporting director the other day. He was stopped at a pre-Champions League press conference and he was asked about them. And he, unsurprisingly, he said, look, we're not going to make any plans until after the final. He was always going to say that. There is going to be a decision now on Greenwood. We are coming to the point. His loan in Spain has ended. He's got back onto his feet out there in La Liga. He's gradually got back up to speed with his performances. We've discussed in previous podcasts the importance of the swiftness of making this decision, because it wouldn't be a good look for Greenwood to report for the first day of pre-season at Carrington. But it does really have to be high on the agenda, doesn't it, of Sir Jim Ratcliffe and his team?
Unless they've made that decision already, and I think the noise around Greenwood is all about which club could he be sold to this summer, and he should be sold. I think it's completely the right thing to do. It's something that it's the conclusion they should have come to in the first place, rather than looking to reintegrate him into the team. And that was a mistake, and it didn't reflect well on anyone at United last season. And the fact that someone at the club used the word tragedy to describe the probability that he won't play for United again was extremely inappropriate as well. I think he's been quite fortunate to have moved on to another club as quickly as he has. There were certain clubs who did broach the possibility of loaning Greenwood or taking Greenwood, and when word got out, there was the word from United was that there would be a bit of a backlash online, and the clubs would be deterred by it. And that's why when that move to Getafe materialised somewhat out of the blue, it was because they'd kept it under wraps, and they didn't want to. They wanted to avoid, of course, any kind of backlash from their supporters. And although there was quite a lot of noise around it at the moment, and a few of our colleagues went out to Spain for his first game, and he got a bit of stick here and there, as you'd expect him to. He's been able to play out the season in Spain in relative. I mean, Getafe are a mid-table team. They ended the season in 12th in La Liga. So he's been able to somewhat operate under the radar, because let's face it, there aren't going to be too many people outside Spain who are tuning in to watch Getafe on a weekly basis, or are obsessively keeping track of Getafe's form and how they're getting on, and how good Greenwood has been. But I think it's clearly, and it did strike me at the time as a stepping stone to potentially a bigger club. Of course, everyone knows why he's ended up at Getafe, and everyone knows why United will probably sell him this summer. But he's a professional footballer who is free to continue with his trade. There's nothing wrong with that, and it just remains to be seen which club he ends up at. But it's obviously, it can't be at United, because the reason why he did not play for United last season is because of the principled supporters. When the news that he was going to be reintegrated into the squad, or the intended reintegration, was leaked, there was a quite vehement backlash from supporters that forced the club into a U-turn, and that's why he ended up on loan at Getafe.
Yeah, I mean, we're both in agreement with Mason Greenwood. He can still have a fulfilling career elsewhere, but we both strongly agree it has to be away from United. We've done very well, Samuel, over 40 minutes today. Not particularly a huge amount to talk to. Hopefully the audio has been better. If not, we will make heads roll at MEN headquarters, Game of Thrones style, heads on the chopping block. Thanks for your time, Samuel.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much.
And have a great weekend to the listeners. Take care, and we'll speak to you next week. Bye-bye.